I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, your communero and co-host.
I'm Dean Detloff, your compañero and co-host.
Oh, all right. That's pretty good. Hey, speaking of comuneros and compañeros, man, Spanish is not anything I should be trying to do. This week on the show, we've got Austin González, who is a member of the DSA International Committee. He's also a member of the DSA NPC, and he's running for DSA NPC again, in case that's a thing that you're interested in. Anyways, the thing about Austin that you got to know is that he just got back from Venezuela. He was there. He met Nicolas Maduro. He gave him a big fist bump or something. I don't know. Pretty cool, though. And he also, saw the communes and went to a big leftist conference there. And you'll hear him talk all about it on the show. It's a pretty neat conversation, to say the very least.
Yeah, we have also done a bunch of other episodes about Venezuela in the past. If you're after that, about 1,000 years ago, we did an episode with George Chicoré Omar talking about the communes, and then more recently in the last few years we've done a number of episodes with Jim Hodgson, who used to work at the United Church of Canada, doing all kinds of really interesting stuff, including going to Venezuela as an election observer. So if you want more Venezuela content, it's back there in the archives, but really glad to have Austin tell us a little bit more about what's going on right now on the ground. Let's take it over to Austin.
This week, we're joined by Austin González. Austin, welcome to the show. Whenever we have someone new on the podcast, we usually just start by asking them to introduce themselves rather than us bumbling through it ourselves. So, do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what you're all about?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to the show today. Really happy to be here and very, very happy to talk about the things that we're going to talk about today. So a little bit about who I am, why I'm on this podcast, right? Well, my name is Austin González. I am a Virginia-based organizer of Puerto Rican descent. In particular, I've organized within DSA, that is the Democratic Socialists of America, for, almost about 5 years now. I helped co-found what would become the Richmond, Virginia chapter of DSA back in 2017. A couple years later, I would get elected to what's known as the National Political Committee within DSA back in 2019. The National Political Committee being the highest governing body of DSA between convention years, that is. It's through my work on the NPC that I've been, honored, I suppose privileged, maybe I might even say, to engage in such important work, such as the work I've done on the International Committee, which I know we'll be talking a little bit about today, but I'd also be remiss without discussing the work I've done on our mutual aid working group as well, and some of the other committees and working groups that, once again, I've had the honor of working with in DSA. But once again, that's primarily my background, and once again, what brings me here, and specifically that international work is without a doubt my pride and joy, I suppose.
Yeah, that's great. It's been really exciting, I think, to watch those conversations unfold in DSA. I'm in Canada, so I'm not a DSA member, but very heartened to see all that going on. So excited to learn more. Recently, you got to go with a DSA delegation to a conference in Venezuela. and you toured a bit of the country. You met Nicolas Maduro. You saw some communes. It looked like a wild time, kind of living vicariously through you all. And we want to hear about that. We've done some episodes on Venezuela in the past and Christian solidarity with the people of Venezuela. But before we dive more into the country and the specifics, can you just say a little bit about why you were there?
Absolutely. So, yeah, just being totally upfront, I could probably talk about this subject and the things that our DSA delegation did in Venezuela for at least 5 hours, right? So I will do my best to condense some of the different things we did, and in particular, condensing this answer here. Why we were there. What event were we attending? That is. Well, our DSA delegation was invited to attend what's known as the Bicentennial Congress of the Peoples. What is that exactly? Well, the Bicentennial Congress of the Peoples was an international gathering, an international conference, right, that the Venezuelan government put together, celebrating the 200th anniversary of Venezuelan independence, specifically the 200th anniversary of what's known as the Battle of Carabobo, which was led by Simon Bolivar and Jose Antonio Paez, which was the battle that essentially guaranteed Venezuelan independence. Since this is, of course, an event that's very important to people within Venezuela, and I would argue an event that's very important to people throughout the Americas and even throughout the world, right? Since Venezuelan independence and the struggle against the Spanish Empire was objectively a good thing, I would argue, right? This led to the abolition of slavery in Venezuela and throughout northern South America. So once again, just an objectively good thing. This gathering was, once again, the Venezuelans sent out invitations to organizations across the world, right? We were there when we actually were able to participate in this conference. Once again, I got the breadth and the scope of just how many people were there, right? Hundreds and hundreds of delegates from North America, obviously, from South America, obviously, also from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, literally people from leftist parties, socialist parties, leftist movements, right? Workers' movements from across the world. And once again, it was just so beautiful to have us all in one space together, sharing ideas, networking, which was the primary goal here for our DSA delegation, right? To go down there for this Congress, the Bicentennial Congress of the Peoples of the World, as it was known, right? And meet other leftist movements, right? Not just within the Americas, but within the entire world, right? And once again, just to be present in these spaces, right? I think there's a specific duty, I would even say a specific responsibility for leftists or socialists or progressives, whatever you want to call it, within the United States to be engaging with socialist movements and leftist movements across the world. And I think this Congress in particular was a big opportunity for our organization to do just that. So that was kind of the reasoning of why we went down there, right? And once again, just the historical significance of this event to Venezuelans and not just to Venezuelans, but really to the entire world.
Yeah, absolutely. That rules. Man, the International Committee has been so exciting lately, kind of following that on Twitter and seeing you all go to Venezuela and even into Peru. It's just been really cool to see those connections being made. That makes me, I think, really excited about the DSA and maybe what's coming in the future. So really neat stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A little bit more, I guess, about your trip to Venezuela then. There's this conference you went to, and that's great. And we're here for it for sure. But we really want to hear about, I think, some of the other things of your trip as well. There's like a lot to say about Venezuela and international politics, but something really compelling about the socialist project in Venezuela is obviously the communes and the communal councils. So we've talked a lot about that on this podcast and about participatory planning in Venezuela. But since you've actually visited, I don't know, maybe you could just tell us what you saw. I think it'd be really cool to hear about your experience with the communes.
Absolutely. So something that a lot of people got to realize is that the vast majority of the time that our DSA delegation spent down there in Venezuela was spent with the communes, right? Was spent meeting these comuneros, right? These communards, right? These people that struggle in these communes and really understanding their projects and really understanding, what they do and the importance of their projects, right? I honestly lost count of how many communes we met with, right? We met with the Alexis Vive commune, right, which is based in 23 de Enero, one of the most militant, leftist barrios within Venezuela, right? We met with Otro Beta, another very prominent commune, right? We were able to spend some time visiting the rural communes, right, out in the state of Anzoátegui in particular. We were able to meet different communes. We spent time with river communes, right, which was an amazing experience in and of itself, right? Communes that literally devote their time to cleaning up, rivers and trash there. And we were able to do that sort of stuff with them. I'd say, considering myself somebody who is in touch with the commune project, or like somebody who considers himself someone that is knowledgeable about the commune project, I learned so much being down there and actually meeting them face to face. My conception of the communes before I went down there was based around some of the more prominent or famous ones, so to speak, right? Communes such as El Maizal, right, where they grow and process corn. Communes such as the pioneros, right, the pioneers, who are like squatters that take over unused land. What I didn't truly grasp and didn't really understand until I actually was able to be there and meet with them and talk with them is that a lot of these communes, they do everything, right? They do everything. And there's various different reasons for that, right? Primarily because of how crippled the state has become because of the sanctions and because of the blockade. And that was a consistent theme that these communes would talk to us about, but in part due to that. And in part due to just the nature of the commune project, right? These communes do everything, right? Almost every commune we went to, they grow their own food, they process their own food, they make their own clothes, they clean up their communities themselves, they provide protection for their communities themselves. Comuna Luisa Cáceres in once again in the countryside in Anzoátegui told us how they they were working with other communes to create a communal city, right? And let me be very clear about what these communes are, right, or what they truly consist of. These communes would tell us how, like, we'd be meeting with leaders of the communes who would tell us that these communes incorporate hundreds of families, right? These are thousands of people within these communes that we met with. And this is truly grassroots, worker power, so to speak, right? This is not the state, owning the resources in this area and telling people what to do. No, this is literally people from the grassroots, from the ground up, building this their own society, right? And it's not to say that they don't occasionally come in conflict with like their local bureaucrats or somebody from the government. They definitely do. And part of the reasons that occasionally does happen is because, once again, I really got a grasp of how they truly do fill the roles of the state, right? Or they are gradually getting to a place where they are occupying the role of the state in their own, backyard. And we would talk to these communaires about, the contradictions within the government, right? How they viewed things, right? And I don't think a single person we talked to was just totally uncritical of the government, right? I don't think a single person we talked to gave us some sort of like canned line about how, oh, yes, we love Maduro and blah, blah, blah. Every single person we talked to had a very nuanced view of their government, right? I think that can kind of get lost in the quote unquote discourse sometimes. Every single person we talked to would say something to the effect of, we recognize that Venezuela is still a capitalist society, right? But Venezuela is a society that is building towards something beyond that, building towards socialism, right? That's what they're trying to build toward. And recognizing the contradictions that we deal with within our government is an important part of that, right? Of course, our government's not perfect. Of course, the government's not perfect. We're dealing with a society that, once again, is still, in many ways, is just escaping, hundreds of years of colonialism, right? Hundreds of years of exploitation, right? There's a lot of contradictions within Venezuelan society that the socialist movement is just beginning to come to grips with, right? Does that mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Does that mean that we should isolate these contradictions and say that it's the fault of the government, right? The Comuneros certainly did not have that opinion, right? Once again, their opinions were very nuanced, which was, yes, these contradictions exist. The struggle towards socialism is very hard. But fundamentally, it is this government that supports our project, right? It is this government, it is Maduro himself who supports the communes in once again becoming a place that can, or becoming communities that can self-sustain themselves, right? So though they come in conflict with local bureaucrats or conflict with the government from time to time, once again, it's a dance that they do, right? Because once again, they are building toward a socialist society, and it's not always easy, it's not always perfect, it's not always linear, but it's once again the work that they do is critically important. And I it's funny, like I said before I went down there, it's tough to truly grasp exactly what these people are doing and what these people are building. In the United States, or in the left and in the socialist world, or whatever we want to call it, we talk a lot about governments like Cuba, which are very heavy on like state ownership, right? To me, the Venezuelan model is such a fascinating one that more people would be benefited learning from, analyzing, right? That emphasis on worker self-management within the communes, backed, of course, by a strong state that can help facilitate these sorts of things. But once again, the communes themselves, once again, I lost count of how many communes I was able to meet with, because each experience was some. It's amazing. Each experience with a commune was like the most fulfilling and enriching experience you could possibly imagine, and yet somehow when we would meet another commune, it would be just as enriching and fulfilling, right? It's hard to put into words.
It's so cool to hear you talk through that, and especially drawing out the the contradictions and the nuance of the way that the people in the communes might feel toward the government. On the one hand, they might have criticisms, and like, I mean, who doesn't have criticisms of their own government? But at the same time, it was people like Chavez and Maduro that incorporated the communes into the state,
Absolutely.
and as like a political vehicle. So it makes some sense. I think one thing that really floors me about the communes, and something that I've read about it in books, like I haven't been there, obviously, but like the communes, they can expropriate private property, like they own the means of production themselves. I don't know. Can you just tell us a little bit about like what that looks like?
Absolutely. It's quite remarkable. Once again, just like you say, these are places where people literally own the means of production in many cases, right? To me, it was truly seeing in face to face, right? And I hope this isn't too dramatic, right? But this is literally seeing face to face the withering away of the state, so to speak, right? In many ways, that's what it felt like. So to this example, in particular, like being able to, expropriate land, I think once again, the best example here is the pioneros, right? The pioneers, the squatters, right? This was the first commune that I was able to visit, right? And it was an amazing experience. We went into one of the more urban areas of Caracas, right? In fact, this is one of the more wealthier areas of Caracas, believe it or not. And what we saw was, once again, lots that were once totally vacant lots that were just land owned by rich people who basically did nothing with it, right? These pioneros, right, literally would occupy, or this is what they do, right? They occupy these sorts of unused plots of land and they start building houses on it, right? Now, what's amazing, and once again, the importance of having a government that backs this project, I think, is a very good example in this case as well, which is the government, rather than looking at these people, these squatters, right, and saying, oh, no, this is not your land, you got to get off. The government has a system set up where these people can, apply for permits, right? They can apply for recognition from the government, right? And once they get that recognition, they then have government protection from, some of the wealthy people within the area who do not want them on the land, right? And it's, once again, it was just amazing to walk through these houses, to talk to talk with these people, right? Who had once again built this land from nothing, right? And for anybody who knows Latin American history, really just general America's history, really the history of the world, dare I even say, right? It's that the struggle for land, right? The struggle for land use is critically important, right? I once again go back to the importance of this in Latin America because of how much land is just unused in large estates, right? Latifundia, as they call it, right? And that struggle for land reform, that struggle to turn these unused lands into productive lands is so important. And you're absolutely right in stating that the communes are at the forefront of this struggle. And I think that's a critical component of, as I mentioned earlier, this dance that the communes do with the government, right? Because they're not always totally in line with each other. They don't always get assistance from the government, right? Sometimes, once again, if you have a local bureaucrat who's worried about his power base being threatened, right, or is, has some sort of relationship with, what other, like the wealthy landowners that are in their municipality, might have issues with them, right? But fundamentally, in these areas, like the Pioneros commune that I went to in Caracas, it is the government that is protecting them from the wealthy people that want them off this land. So once again, it's a good example of how you need many moving parts to make something like this possible, right? You need a leftist government in power to make this possible. You need people on the ground struggling to make this possible, right? You can't have either of those things isolated in a vacuum, right? You can't just have, like, I obviously love Bernie Sanders as much as the next guy, but if Bernie was elected president, he would need strong people on the ground pushing forward, right? He would need people pushing, any like bad senators, Joe Manchin. We would need people in West Virginia, right? Struggling, things like that. You need people on the ground. You need all of it together, right? It all goes hand in hand together, and we can't look at these sorts of things in a vacuum. But once again, yes, the government's support in these areas is critical for communes being able to actually expropriate that land and put it in the hands of the workers, right? Once again, this is not the state taking this land, it's the communes taking this land, it's the people taking this land. So I think there's tremendously important and valuable lessons to be taken from that.
It's really cool to hear you talk about that some more. Like Matt said, I mean, we've read it in books, we've read some philosophers talking about it, right? We've talked to journalists, we've talked to people who've been there and so on. But I think really the most exciting thing is always getting a chance to get those impressions of what it's like to sort of be around that energy. One thing to maybe just address the elephant in the room, as always, is to talk a little bit about Maduro. And of course, you had an opportunity to not just meet with him, but to talk about him and to talk with other people about their experiences and to participate in this meeting of peoples. So, Venezuela is sort of a stock villain in anti-socialist rhetoric in the U.S. You mentioned Bernie Sanders. Even people like Bernie and AOC, they intentionally distance themselves from Venezuela and Maduro. Bernie, I think, referred to Maduro as a dictator at one point during the last round of primary debates. So having been to the country yourself, what do you make of these kinds of pictures of Venezuela or the story that's told about it? Did Maduro seem dictatorial to you when you met him? What's the vibe on the ground about all of that?
Sure, very important question, and as you might imagine, a lot to unpack there, right? I think two multiple critical points come to my mind immediately, right? First, to the accusation that he's a quote unquote dictator, right? I think it's important to point out, and it's important to mention that during the elections most recently, right, the opposition itself, right, the opposition consisted of some of the more liberal political parties like Acción Democrática or COPEI, right? They themselves said that these elections were legitimate, right? That these elections were clean. Any observers watching these elections said the same, right? The reason the United States or some of the far-right opposition led by Juan Guaido will say, oh, these elections were illegitimate and unfair is because they boycotted them, right? And why did they boycott these elections? Because they knew they were going to lose, or they couldn't risk losing, right? They couldn't risk losing. Even if it might have been a close election, they could not take that risk because it would be too damaging to their narrative, right? So I think that's a very important point to make from the outset. Another point I would make here, going back to my own personal experience, right, in literally fist bumping him, right, and meeting Nicolas Maduro, right. I have to say, like being in the room with him and with the foreign minister and various different advisors. And obviously this is just an anecdote, right? But still, you've got me on the podcast, so I'm going to give my anecdotes. The environment was very relaxed. It was very chill. Like they were making jokes with each other, right? There was anybody who thinks or has this impression that it's this weird, like, we have to be, calm in front of the dear leader sort of environment. That could not have been further from the truth, right? The translator was catching him on slip ups from here and there, once again joking around with him, busting his chops, so to speak, right? And it wasn't weird at all, right? Everybody was totally chill, totally relaxed with it. It was a very friendly environment, dare I say. But once again, that's just my own personal anecdote. As far as like conversations that I had with people on the ground, once again, it was very fascinating to talk to so many people, average working class Venezuelans, comuneros, people in the communes, people outside the communes, right? Just average working class Venezuelans. And how many of them, once again, would say things to the effect of, this government, it hasn't always been, perfect. There have been some moves they've made that have, upset me, being, a bit toward the right when it comes to economic policy, or, maybe not doing enough to support, the struggle for campesinos, or, the struggle for women's rights, things of that nature. But fundamentally, it is Maduro that supports our struggle to get those gains, right? That supports our struggle to empower campesinos, right? That supports our struggle to empower the communes, right? We talk to many feminist groups, right? In fact, I should say it's amazing. Almost every commune we went to, maybe literally all of them, were women led, right? Almost all of them, right? And when we would engage them on women's rights and feminist issues in Venezuela, I think there's a particularly instructive anecdote that that one feminist leader told us, which is, the revolution, right? It's been long, it's been hard. Women have been a part of it for such a long time, and we've been fighting for women's rights and getting abortion rights in Venezuela. But unfortunately, what has happened is, right as we were on the cusp of really beginning this a dialogue here and making improvements here, this is when the sanctions and the blockade got cranked up to 11, so to speak, right? And because of that, now, the party, PSUV, right, the Socialist Party, the socialist movement in Venezuela, the conversation that they're having is primarily one of, can we put food on our table, right? Can we have clothes for ourselves, right? Can we even have an economy that can function, right? The sanctions and the blockade have been so devastating that it makes it impossible for them to have any other sorts of conversations. And I even say to anybody who says, oh my goodness, you see Maduro's drifted to the right, he is a dictator, right? The Maduro regime, whatever, right? If you truly dislike Maduro, right, you should also be in favor of lifting the blockade and the sanctions, right? Because the blockade and the sanctions are, once again, a reminder to the Venezuelan people that there are outside forces trying to destabilize this government, right? That there are outside forces that don't want to see these projects succeed. So it's critically important, once again, I like to say, to listen to these people on the ground, right? Rather than talking over the feminist community in Venezuela, or rather than talking over the working class in Venezuela and saying, oh, actually, I think I in the United States know better about your situation, right? We should see where the working class is at. We should see where the feminist movement is at, right? And everybody I talked, for the most part, the vast majority of people I talked to were supportive of Maduro and his government precisely for those reasons, right? Because despite the fact that there are issues within the bureaucracy, and despite the fact that there are right-wing elements within PSUV that drag their feet on issues such as women's rights, it is the Maduro government that is, once again, that is in favor of pushing these struggles forward. In fact, I think an interesting anecdote, going back to the meeting with Maduro, that I think kind of is an interesting window into this conversation as well. When I found out that our delegation was going to be meeting with Nicolas Maduro, one of our attachés took me aside, says to me, hey, Austin, tomorrow when we go back to Caracas, because we were still in the countryside at the time, he says to me, when we go back to Caracas, we're going to have a meeting with the president. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. I had a feeling this might happen, but okay, that's fun. My attaché says to me, he says, the speaker or the person that the president wants as the spokesperson is one of the female comrades that we had within our delegation, right? Jen McKinney, who's, I should also say, chair of the National Political Committee. And he says to me the reason that Nicolas Maduro, or well, one of the reasons that Nicolas Maduro would prefer Jen McKinney to be this spokesperson is because he recognizes how deep the machista culture is within Venezuela and thinks it's important, to have strong women leaders be, as visible as possible, right? To try and break down those barriers of machismo that do exist deeply within Venezuelan culture. And perhaps I'm going off at a tangent here, but one last point to this point that I'm making here is that, once again, as I said earlier, I think it's dare I use this word? I think it's un-Marxist. Is that a word? I think it's un-Marxist to isolate contradictions, right? To look at Venezuela's machista culture and say, "Oh my goodness, look how backward they are on abortion. Clearly, this is not a socialist government," right? I think it's very un-Marxist to isolate these contradictions that are, once again, legacies of hundreds of years of exploitation, hundreds of years of colonialism by the Spanish, of course, in this case, right? I think it's very un-Marxist to isolate these contradictions and once again try to say that this means the government is, somehow wrong or somehow backward or somehow doesn't know what they're doing, right? We should, once again, primarily, we should make an attempt to understand why Venezuela is like that. And second, and this is the number one thing, once again, we should listen to the Venezuelan feminist community and listen to the Venezuelan working class and what they think is the right step forward for Venezuela. Once again, like I said, I don't know if I went off on a tangent there, but a lot of thoughts started to pop in my head as I started going there.
No, it's a good tangent. I'm here for it. I'm here for this great tangent. All about these wild stories of Nicolas Maduro. Very cool. Well, I don't know. Now that you're back, I guess, what have you taken away? Like, what kinds of lessons about I don't know, socialism or solidarity or whatever have you taken back with you to the U.S.? We've been talking a lot about imperialism and solidarity on this podcast, and it'd be cool to hear you kind of parse this out. Like, what does it mean to be anti-imperialist and invested in solidarity and invested in this like relationship with people, in a different hemisphere of the globe than we are, in the heart of global capitalism, in the heart of the place that's putting these sanctions on them? What does it mean to do anti-imperialism in that kind of space?
Absolutely. Once again, a lot to unpack here, but once again, very important question, right? So, like I said a little bit earlier, I think, and like you touched upon just here, right? I think there is a certain duty, a certain responsibility for us leftists in the United States to, once again, be pushing for proper, anti-imperialism and be pushing for an effective anti-sanctions campaign, an effective anti-blockade campaign, right? Pushing for the normalization of relations with countries like Venezuela, right? Even this is, to me, the primary reason that I thought it was important for DSA's delegation to meet personally with Maduro, right? Not to necessarily endorse everything that his government has done, right? But to once again normalize talking with Nicolas Maduro, help normalize this government, right? Don't treat them like a pariah or like a boogeyman, right? No, we met with the president of Venezuela because he asked for a meeting, right? We didn't look at this as some icky, dirty thing that we couldn't do, right? And I think that's a big responsibility that leftists in the United States have, right? I think we can have, I think whenever we have a conversation on Venezuela or Maduro or even Cuba, right? Cuba's in the news, right? First, second, third, fourth, fifth concern should be ending the sanctions, right? The first and last concern for leftists in the United States should be ending the sanctions, right? Rather than finger wagging at leftists in the global south or finger wagging on, oh, no, I think we know how to do this better than they do, right? Of course, I would say maybe the left in the United States should try and get into government first before we try and tell other leftist movements who have actually been in government how to do it, right? But maybe that's just me. I think what I think about, once again, to me, that's one of the crucially important aspects of, once again, pushing for proper anti-imperialism, so to speak, within the United States, which is so important, right? I even like to say, I mean, not just me, right? Plenty of people say this, saving the environment. One of the keys to saving the environment is fighting the war machine, which is the number one polluter in the world, right? Our war machine here in the United States. There's a tremendous debt that we owe the rest of the world in fighting our military industrial complex and fighting the empire, right? To me, that should be one of our main priorities, right? A proper anti-war campaign, a proper anti-sanctions campaign, all of those things. Now, you also asked a little bit about, lessons that, we can take back in general, lessons that, we might have learned within Venezuela. I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned in both trips, I should say, I was a part of the Peru delegation as well. One of the biggest lessons I learned in both Peru and Venezuela is just how important it is to, once again, be connected to your bases, right? Just how important social movements are, right? Just obviously the union movement is critically important, right? It's so important to be connected to your bases, to be connected to your communities, right? It's so important to be connected to your communities, actually tied into your communities, and once again, pushing for social change through those avenues, right? That's how you can build a proper socialist movement, I would say, right? That's how you can get to a place where rather than trying to declare, oh, we are the Democratic Socialist Party or whatever, right? Rather than getting to we can get to a place where we have proper social movements that could hold a party accountable, right? That could hold elected officials accountable, right? Which to me is one of the biggest lessons that I learned in places, both in Peru and Venezuela, right? How important that grassroots people power is, right? And another important lesson that I think socialists, leftists, progressives, whatever we want to call it, in the United States or the global north or anywhere, should know or can learn from Venezuela is that Venezuelan socialism is different from Cuban socialism, is different from Vietnamese socialism, is different from any other socialisms in the world, right? You got to adapt to your local conditions, right? Socialism in the United States will probably even look different from how it looks in these other places, right? I imagine it would, right? You got to adapt to your local conditions. And I think I relate that to the first point there, as far as like being in touch with the social movements and being in touch with your communities, right, is critically important. That's how you can properly adapt to your local conditions and see, where the contradictions exist in our society, right? And using those to once again bring the socialist movement forward. I think that's critically important as well. And that's been how the Bolivarian revolution has been able to happen, right? People fixate on Chavez, right? They fixate on Maduro. Now they fixate on the figureheads, right? Just look at Bolivia, right? People fixated on Evo, right? Oh yeah, Evo, the movements, it's all about Evo, right? After Evo was couped right out of office by the military, what happened? It was the people that brought Mas back into power, because these movements go way deeper than their figureheads, right? I think people are extremely naive, or the U.S. government, I should say, is extremely naive if it thinks, oh yeah, we can just we just get rid of Maduro and we're good. Nope. These social movements, these communes, these people that are struggling on the ground, they aren't just going to suddenly forget all the gains they've made in the past few decades. They aren't going to suddenly forget all the struggling they've done in the last few decades, right? They would rise up and fight back, right? Just like what happened in Bolivia in 2019 when Evo was couped, right? And once again, this is circling back, this is why I relate to strong social movements, a strong union movement, right? And tying all of those things together, because that is how you can properly maintain a socialist movement that is not only in power, but is actually delivering gains for people, is actually pushing the struggle forward, right? I think that's critically important. And yeah, once again, that's a lesson that I don't just draw from Venezuela, but I draw from the 21st century socialists in general in Latin America, from the pink tide, whatever we want to call it, right? Since once again, this is something that manifested itself in Bolivia, and as I saw in Peru, is beginning to manifest itself there as well.
Yeah, it's really cool to kind of especially put that emphasis on Maduro, Chavez, and so on. They are important. They're significant characters, and they shape the movement for sure. But you mentioned Bolivia returning the MAS to power after Evo was couped. It's the same in Venezuela, right? Returning the PSUV to power after Chavez was couped in the 2000s. So it's a really good line. Okay, this might rub up against what you were just saying, but maybe not. We'll see. But the Bolivarian Revolution, I think it's so fascinating because it is an example of what democratic socialism could look like, right? You mentioned it's not the Cuban model or the Vietnamese model. It is a different kind of model with all of its own contradictions. But it's not really a model, it seems to me, that a lot of people in the U.S. take too seriously, especially people who identify as democratic socialists, even though It may look quite different in the United States. Nevertheless, this is an experiment that comes out of some similar sensibilities, perhaps. What do you think that an organization like the DSA or people who have begun to identify as democratic socialists in the last 5-6 years or so could learn from that experiment in Venezuela?
Absolutely, 1,000,000%. I love this question. This is something I love to say, which is, whether people like it or not, people got to acknowledge that the most successful example of a democratic socialist, program or experiment in our lifetimes, it happened in Venezuela, right? It just like you say, it was Chavez, right? Did Chavez run as like a fire-breathing communist? No, he didn't, right? He ran for all intents and purposes as a democratic socialist and has maintained a democratic socialist movement within Venezuela, right? And that movement itself, once again, there are so many lessons to be drawn here. But I think it's important to recognize that this movement that elected Chavez to power and was able to rewrite the constitution of Venezuela, this movement went back decades, right? This movement didn't just start with Chavez. It didn't even just start with his attempted military coup in 1992, right? This was a movement that had been building for decades, right? That had experienced periods of time where they were forced, underground, during the repression of like the Cold War when, leftists were targeted, right? This was movements that saw the worst of saw the best of the worst of the oil economy, right? After the oil boom during the 1970s because of the the crisis, so to speak, against the United States. They saw a booming economy. Afterwards, during the 1980s, when the price of oil went down, they saw the effects of a devastated economy, which unfortunately is happening again in Venezuela. And these people, coalesced in movements such as the Caracazo in 1989, right? Attacking, rising up, so to speak, against the government, which was, cutting, the social services, which, Venezuelans, they woke up to a world where even oil itself was insanely expensive, which of course did not make sense to them since Venezuela has so much oil, right? So once again, building these projects within your communities, not just looking at a national campaign like Bernie Sanders or we'll see if AOC decides to run for president one day, who knows, right? But these campaigns need to be accompanied with strong grassroots social movements, with strong unions, right? Because if Bernie or AOC, right, or whoever, right, was ever elected president, my goodness, it would be, a sea change. It would be beautiful, right? I would welcome it. I would support it. But we can't expect them to simply get into office and then, click the socialism button, right? That's simply not how it works, right? If Bernie or any other democratic socialist was elected president, I think people are a bit naive to think that, okay, all of a sudden, snap of the fingers, now police violence, doesn't exist anymore. It's not how it's going to work, right? There would be a need for broad bases of support on the grassroots level, true institution building, so to speak. And this is why I'm a member of DSA, right? I see DSA as something that can help facilitate those sorts of things. I see DSA as a social movement in and of itself, right? Getting everybody who calls themselves a socialist in one house, right? At least that's the goal, right? I love the fact that our organization is a multi-tenancy organization. I love the fact that there's people that I can engage with and debate with over, what our DSA delegation did in Venezuela, right? I think that's a beautiful thing, right? To have that sort of ideological struggle, and once again to share the ideas that we all have with each other. I think that's critically important. Social movements like that, right? And I know DSA has also done a lot of work trying to engage with the labor movement through the Pro Act campaign, which has been a beautiful thing, right? Things like that are so critically important, right? Strengthening the union movement, strengthening our social movements, strengthening our connection to the bases, right? Because the base is where true social change happens and is where true socialist movements are built, right? And that's what I think is one of the biggest lessons from Chavez's election, right? You mentioned the 2002 coup. Wonderful example, right? Wonderful example. If Chavez did not have a connection to the bases, right? If those bases had not spent decades, building community organizations, building, the things that kind of manifested themselves in the Fifth Republic movement, right? That coup against Chavez probably would have been successful in 2002, right? Because he wouldn't have had, such a wide base of supporters that came out to defend him, to protect him, and to protect their gains, right? To protect their new constitution, right? So once again, having that connection to those bases is so critically important. And I think it's something that we can is one of the many lessons, right, that we could learn from Chavez and more broadly from the other, quote unquote democratic socialist experiments that have happened in Latin America, right, including, Bolivia. Of course, there's plenty of lessons to be drawn from Bolivia and the example of Mas. But once again, just a connection to the base would be my answer to that.
Yeah, that's a really good word. I mean, I'm a DSA member. I see these things as well, and I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. There's a lot of things to be, really excited to be involved in. Something that we talk about in this podcast every now and again is Marta Harnacker, who is, like one of the big political theorists of 21st century socialism. The way that she describes it is that you need this strong base because a president can only do so much, right? They can do so much, and you need these other institutions, these other bases of power to help you kind of capture the rest of the state, and that's a harder task for sure. But yeah, well, it'd be very interesting to see, how DSA is up to that challenge in the future of the United States. Well, maybe we could turn a little bit here and talk about DSA and the International Committee because well, you're a part of it, and the other folks that were on the that went on the trip with you, they were part of it as well. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about the International Committee? Like, what's it trying to accomplish within DSA? How has the DSA responded to it, kind of as a whole? What's going on there?
Sure. Two things real quick. One, because can't help myself and have to comment on Marta Harnacker because she is amazing,
Please.
right? And once again, it is a big inspiration to me, right? And you have to quickly point out, look at an example of a left that has not been able to properly connect with its bases. I would argue Ecuador, right, where there's been a big disconnect between the left and the indigenous communities, right? And look what's happened. They have lost power and they have been struggling to get it back ever since. Now, granted, there's a lot more nuances, and the situation's a bit more complicated there. But to me, once again, you look at an example of not properly being in touch with your bases. Anyways, once again, you mentioning Marta Harnacker reminded me of that. Yeah. So, anyways, oh goodness, the DSA International Committee. Oh yeah, where do I start? Oh my goodness, like I said at the onset, this has been. I mean, saying this has been the honor of my life, the privilege of my life would be such a massive understatement, right? Like I can't even I can't even put into words how much this work has meant to me, how much, once again, I'm deeply humbled to have been a part of this, right? A little bit of prehistory here, and a little bit of context. At the 2019 National Convention, myself, I helped co-author a resolution that dealt with some, foreign policy issues, specifically anti-imperialism and decolonization. There were a couple other resolutions that were introduced at the same time regarding, restructuring the International Committee and turning it into a committee that, represents, more voices, more members, right? A committee that's opened up to our membership, something that was important to me at the time. These resolutions were all adopted. They were all passed, right? So when I got elected to the NPC, right, the National Political Committee, one of the first things I was thinking was, well, heck, I want to be a part of the process of, implementing these resolutions. I want to help build our International Committee into like a true, foreign policy wing that can actually, a foreign relations wing even, right, that has actual relations with, political parties across the world that can, that can send, delegations abroad and stuff like that, right? This was a long process. It took a long time to get us to this point, right? I was deeply honored to be able to do this work alongside, fellow NPC member Blanca Estevez, who I should mention her, myself, and a few others are running for NPC re-election on a slate together known as Renewal. Google it, people, or Twitter it, maybe. Yeah, and the work we've done on the International Committee, like I said, has been the most humbling work of my life. It was a long time coming, these delegations to Peru and Venezuela. One of the directives that was put in, one of the resolutions that passed at the 2019 National Convention, was putting a focus toward engaging with leftist movements in Latin America, and specifically leftist movements of a mass nature, right? A mass movement nature within Latin America, right? So at the beginning of this year, Blanca and I were discussing ourselves, alongside other members of international committee leadership, different things we could do to, take this international committee to the next level. And, at the time, I just mentioned Ecuador, right? At the time, there were critical elections going on in Ecuador, right? And as the elections came and went, I thought to myself, wow, why weren't we able to send an election observer delegation? I think it, really would have meant something. Simultaneously, the elections in Peru had just passed their first round, and it was clear that the second round of Peru's presidential elections were going to be critically important. So we began the process of coordinating with groups on the ground, coordinating with allies in Peru, coordinating with other friendly international institutions such as the Progressive International and the Party of the European Left, and sending like a joint, international left sort of delegation to Peru to observe their presidential elections, right? And once again, these sorts of things would not have been possible without these, structural reforms that, we had made happen within the International Committee. When I first began my term on the NPC, the International Committee was, for all intents and purposes, a closed committee, right? This was a committee that had, occasional open application intervals, but once again was still a bit of a self-selecting, group that had, had not been opened up to a broader scope of our membership. Luckily, and I'm extremely happy and proud to say, now our international committee has hundreds of members in it, right? There's multiple different there's different arms of our international committee, right, that take over different aspects of foreign policy, right? Our international secretariat, which maintains relations with other political parties and is truly like our foreign relations arm, right? Our international steering committee, right, which actually oversees like the actual building of campaigns internally, right? And, something they've been working on recently is the Syringes for Cuba campaign, right, which is a beautiful thing, right? Our different regional, working groups, right, which focus on specific, focus on specific regions, and some of them focused on specific issues, right, like economics and trade, right, which was critically important for for COVID-19 vaccine distribution, right, which I know our allies in the Progressive International did an amazing campaign regarding that, right? These sorts of things, to me, fundamentally, all the work that I've helped do on the International Committee, right, with alongside so many amazing people, right? I can't stress that enough, how so many great people have been a part of this process and how it wouldn't be possible without them, right? To me, this process has been about taking a committee that was one of the oldest in our organization, taking a committee that had existed for, I believe, over 10 years, right? Taking that committee, which was built at a time when DSA was, a couple thousand members, and broadening out its structures to bring it to a place where now it is befitting, I would say, of an organization that is nearly 100,000 members strong. Its structures are getting to a place where it is accommodating to our larger membership right now. And that's not to say that the International Committee is not a work in progress. All of our structures within DSA are, right? All of our structures should be continuing to grow, continuing to modify itself, continuing to adapt, right, to the conditions that we exist in, right? But still, I think fundamentally getting, like, it is, it's amazing. I mentioned Blanca Estevez a little bit earlier. I remember, having a conversation with her at the beginning of this year saying, something to the effect of, will we even be able to do a delegation to Peru and Venezuela, right? So to be sitting here talking about how not only did they happen, but they were extremely successful, right, is astonishing to me, right? And once again, I cannot emphasize enough how much work goes into these sorts of things, and once again, how critically important these sorts of things are, right? And like, if there's a point that I should drive home that I definitely got from being in Peru and Venezuela, it's how thankful everybody down there was to meet with people from the United States. How shocked some of these groups, some of these communes, or some of these movements in Peru's case, right, that we met with, how shocked these people were to meet us. How the common reaction was, wow, you guys are socialists from the United States. That's amazing, right? We're so happy to talk to you guys, right? We're so used to like not having any sort of real connections or engagement to any like larger movements, so to speak, within the United States, right? So they were so happy. And once again, it's just a reminder of the importance this work that our international committee engages in, right? The importance of international diplomacy, the importance of foreign policy, so to speak. And once again, like I say, there's so much we can do better within the international committee. There's so much that I look to do more within our international committee, but without a doubt, it's not even close. This is by far the honor of my life, and I'm humbled every moment I get to engage with my fellow members on the international committee, whether it's somebody on the steering committee, somebody on the secretariat, or even absolutely our rank and file members within our working groups, which are the lifeblood of the international committee. I could not drive home enough how proud I am of that committee.
It's really fun to hear you talk about that. I think, the DSA gets some criticisms from the left as well for not being as anti-imperialist as it ought to be, and including on this podcast that has happened. I think that's one of the more salutary things I see coming out of the U.S. left, at least, is this renewed commitment to building those bridges and apprenticing itself to those lessons. Maybe one last question before we give you a chance to plug at the end, since we're reaching the end of the hour. We didn't prompt you with this, so maybe you don't have any thoughts off the top of your head, but perhaps, you've been to Peru and Venezuela. On the show, we're always talking about Christianity and the left. Peru is, of course, the home of Gustavo Gutierrez, one of the fathers of liberation theology in particular. Most Venezuelans are Catholic. There's a long history of liberation theology there. Chavez himself was a Christian, and Maduro is often drawing from liberation theology rhetoric. Can you tell us anything about that? Did you see any of that on either of your trips? And how do you understand maybe a movement like that in terms of bringing together the religious sectors, or at least the Christian sectors, and the political left?
Oh, yes, absolutely. These are both Peru and Venezuela are deeply, deeply Catholic countries, right? And for sure, you would see elements of that everywhere. In the first, it's actually my second visit to a commune, right? When I went to 23 de Enero, right, which is where the Panelitos are, right, where Alexis Vive Collective is, right, various different communes. We came there during, I'm not sure if it was a holiday or some sort of celebration, right? There were various dances and singing going on all around a altar, right? All around an altar that had like a figure of Jesus Christ, right? So these are deeply religious communities. These are communities that are not just communities, movements that are very much informed and very much inspired by movements such as liberation theology. These are movements that, in many ways, I referenced the building of the social movements and that led to the moment of Chavez. I referenced how these social movements went through periods of going underground, right, during the Cold War. In many cases, when these movements went underground during the Cold War, some of the only places they got any sympathy from were, Catholic priests, liberation theologians. Now, this isn't exactly Venezuela, but the most classic example being, Camilo Torres, right? The priest in Colombia who literally helped, he either helped found or was one of the first members of the guerrilla movement, the National Liberation Army, and famously died, fighting or whatever, and is like an iconic figure of liberation theology within the region, right? And this isn't to say, just like with the government or just like any other social movements, this isn't to say that the left in some ways, or the communities in some ways, have occasionally complicated relationships with their local churches, right? Because in some places in Latin America, the church has also took on, like a landowning sort of role, right? And in some places in Latin America, the church definitely took on a more conservative tint, right? So really it depended on, which sort of communities you went to. But fundamentally, common theme in all of them, right, was once again a connection to a lot of the themes that you get in liberation theology, right? Definitely in the case of Peru and Pedro Castillo, right? And you mentioned Gustavo Gutierrez being from Peru. My brain didn't even make that connection literally till you made that sentence. So that's actually a really good point. But yeah, definitely in the case of Peru, I would say I saw a lot of that. And Peru, I think, is a very interesting example, because I think a lot of people had things to say, right, about maybe Pedro Castillo's more conservative views, right? And people trying to make accusations that maybe these conservative views were inspired by him being, a somewhat religious man, right? Here's the thing. When I met with feminist groups in Peru, when I met with members of the gay community in Peru, every single one of them were supporting Pedro Castillo. And not just that, Pedro Castillo, out of both presidential candidates, right, Pedro Castillo and Keiko Fujimori, only one of them met with members of the gay community, and it was not Keiko Fujimori, right? It was Pedro Castillo. So once again, Pedro Castillo, I use this example because Pedro Castillo is a great example of, for him, fundamentally, his religion inspires his views on poverty, right? Fundamentally, what he will not waver on is that slogan, right? No más pobres en un país rico, right? No more poverty in a rich country, right? That's what he will not waver on. And once again, I think it was extraordinarily clear that these views, in many ways, were informed, in part at least, by his religion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's hard to understand the left of Latin America without understanding religion. I mean, kind of for better and for worse, right? Not just the progressive side, but also the very reactionary side. It's all there mixing around. Well, anyways, this is all really great stuff. I'm learning a lot in this conversation and really enjoying it. But we've kind of come to the end of the hour here. Is there anything that you'd want to plug here at the end?
Absolutely. There's a couple different things I can plug. As I mentioned, for any of my fellow DSA members out there, right? I am running for re-election at our national convention next year. If you know any delegates, if you are a delegate, I'd appreciate the support. And if you do have any questions, for me or my slate mates, right? Renewal, you can go to dsarenewal.com. If you do have any questions for me, I am on Twitter, right? At Gaius, Gaius _ Gracchus, GRACCHUS _ Feel free to shoot me a DM, right? DM's open. That's how this podcast happened, right? DM's open. DM's always open. I'm always happy to have a conversation with people, and literally have a talk about whatever. I also do a podcast as well. It's called Machete y Mate. I do it alongside my brother T and my good friend Leroy. It's a podcast specifically about covering news events in Latin America in English, right, from a leftist perspective, since sometimes it's hard to get that perspective in English. So that's another one of my projects. And once again, fundamentally, I suppose the last thing here, if you're not a DSA member, consider joining dsausa.org/join, since it is an organization I very much believe in.
Cool. Thanks so much for joining us, Austin. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. To go there and support us, there's some cool, great rewards that you get, like access to our Patreon-only Discord channel. You get an early episode every now and again, and also you get access to a behind-the-paywall, current events-ish alternate reality game podcast called The Lock-In. And it's a lot of fun. We do a lot of goofy stuff and talk about current events as well. Pretty great. Anyways, do all those things. And if you can't do those things, that's okay too. You should just give us a nice review on iTunes. That's appreciated as well. All right. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have.